And so with that, I would like to invite our previous speakers to join Julie on camera and with microphone to remember who all that is. I believe that's Joel and Jim and Sarah and Kevin, and there they all are. Thank you so much. Okay, I got about a half dozen questions here that I pulled from the list that has been up prior to the meeting. There's also a couple that have been added in the chat and added to this list while people have been talking. So let's see how many we can get through. I'm going to start directing one at you, Julie, please, since you just finished speaking. And it's about the sort of strong consensus, at least among the lunar science and exploration community, that Gateway is not exactly optimized for lunar surface exploration operations. And is there any kind of trade space between when Gateway comes online, how quickly it's accelerated, how quickly it's built, and what's going on with selection of HLS providers? Are there any moving parts there that could help us?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And if you noticed, the perspective of the lunar surface geology community is very different in that area than the perspective of some of the other user communities. Jim talked a lot about the value that they see from Gateway, as Kevin did as well. So at the first level, that isn't uniform across disciplines. I do recognize that some people see it as a zero-sum game. And so the cross-disciplinary uses of Gateway is one part of that answer. But the other part that may not be as intuitive is that we've done a lot of work in looking at how to use Gateway to make the entire infrastructure allow for frequent access. And the frequent access and repeat access and that sustainability that you heard our AAs talking about is absolutely part and dependent on the Gateway. So if we don't have the Gateway, then we don't have reusable service modules. We don't have the ability to do as frequent of missions to the lunar surface as we would otherwise have. It's a complex optimization, but that refueling, reusability, and having more surface opportunities actually is valuable to the lunar science community as well.
Thank you, Julie. Jim, I know you had a lot of words to say about Gateway in your presentation. Is there anything you'd like to add to what Julie said?
Well, I would just like to augment that. And yes, she mentioned that Gateway does have a lot of applicability for research and science, important and compelling science beyond lunar science. But it's also the architecture. And I'd just like to mention just one example would be the service module. Once that is put in a disposal orbit, that could serve as a fabulous platform for dust research, for observations of the inner heliosphere, looking at the sun at all directions to help improve our capability to predict space weather events. So it's not only just the platform and the reusability of the platform, but it's also the overall architecture that I think has great value for SMD science writ large.
Thanks, Jim. Let's move on to a second question here. I'm guessing Sarah may be the first one to address this, but others of you may have input as well, and that is about our good friend, the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It's been up there about 11 years. And are there any plans afoot? What are the plans to ensure that NASA does not lose the capabilities that LRO represents?
You want me to take this, or you want to take it, Joel?
You can take it, Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, we understand that LRO has a finite lifetime, but it's still a healthy operating spacecraft. It's still getting good data. It's got plenty of fuel to last several more years. But in the interim, we are thinking about what's going to come next. And that's the complicated question. It's not just about what science we want to do next, but it's also an operational spacecraft, and so we've got to take all of those things into consideration. And it's something we're giving a lot of thought to right now.
Joel, you want to follow up a little bit?
Yeah, well, all I'll say is that, LRO has really shown its value both for science and for exploration, since it's been launched, I guess, back in 2009. And we've all learned to rely on its products that it generates. So what we're going to be looking at relatively soon, based on our understanding of how long we think LRO will still go forward, are things like what would updated capabilities that are really needed for a future lunar reconnaissance orbiter be for either science or exploration? And does it make sense to have an orbiter or maybe different spacecraft? There's a number of different options out there for the future that we've still got to get there.
Thank you. Let's see. Let me go to another one here. I think, Julie, I'm going to come back to you on this one. I'm taking popular questions from our portal here. Can you talk a little bit about what the expectation is for the flight cadence once after Artemis 3 is done? We recognize Artemis 3 is kind of, big focus for our first human beings back on the lunar surface from the United States. But what's the outlook for what comes after Artemis 3?
Yeah, so our general plan is a cadence of about annual crewed missions with the support of increasing durations for the crewed missions, as well as increasing access and capabilities on the surface that can be used when the crew isn't there. So what we imagine is over the next 10 years, we'll have this gradual increase in the amount of surface science that can be done both with and without the crew, as well as continued and, from a lunar perspective, incredibly frequent access with that annual crewed missions.
All right, I want to throw it open to anyone else on our group here who would like to weigh in on the cadence of Artemis. I know Julie's probably most authoritative here. All right, very good. Hearing none, let's go on. Let me see here. Let's talk about one of the questions we have here is there used to be a program that many of us love very much called LASER. Is there any kind about lunar, science and research? Is there anything cooking about a lunar-centric research and analysis program to help the Artemis program be successful and sustainable?
I think that one's directed towards me as well. I also love LASER. LASER was the first program I was funded under, and so we all have fond memories of LASER. But Planetary has really moved away from target-based calls, right? We got rid of Mars Fundamental Science Program and the other sort of target-based calls, and are looking at question-based calls like SSW and EW. And so there are plenty of places to propose to lunar research across PSD. And then LASER also covered, sort of human SKG sort of research and space technology research like dust mitigation and whatnot. And I think those are covered as well, right? A lot of that SKG research is funded through Survey, and with the LSIC coming up, you'll hear a little more from Rachel later about that, but you're covering a lot of those technology topics as well. So I feel like we have all of the bases covered under our current program. I don't think we plan to spin up a new program.
That's clear enough. Okay, very good. I'm going to come back. Joel is probably going to be the one who will speak to this the most, but you can all weigh in on this as well. A couple of our audience members noticed there seemed to be some overlap between what the Fed board does and what SEO does. And so, Joel, I think this one's going to come your way. Is there overlap, or is it that just a misperception? What is the relationship between the things that acting in parallel and things that can overlap with one another?
No, there's really not overlap, because what SEO does is we look specifically at science strategy and integration across science divisions, primarily those in SMD, but also working with other government agencies and international partners. And as part of that, SEO does coordinate with Space Technology Mission Directorate for their planning and human exploration operations. But the integration takes place with the federated board, and you could probably see some of this in what Julie Robinson talks about is more than science strategy and integration. It's programmatic integration across all those different space areas. Some of it's extremely operational. Some of it is not related to beyond Earth orbit. It's looking at things that reach back to Earth or to LEO, to ISS, and potential other platforms to LEO. So the scope of the federated board is a bit different than what SEO does. One of the advantages I have is that as heading SEO, I'm the SMD participant on the federated board. So I do get to see to make sure that in particular that there aren't any gaps between what everyone's doing, which we're usually on the lookout for, looking for things that aren't getting done because somebody thinks someone else is doing them.
Excellent, thank you. Another question we have here is, what are the likely effects of the costs of the Viper spacecraft, the rover? Might there be on the overall LGEP, planetary science, RNA, discovery calls. There's some concern out there about that too. Anyone want to comment on that one?
This is Joel. I can comment on that. So Viper is an element of the Lunar Discovery and Exploration Program. That's what it's funded out of. It's not funded out of any other planetary science appropriations. And I noticed the way that the question is phrased. It said something about increases. We've actually known for some time at NASA, based on the scope that we wanted Viper to have, the number of instruments, the number of PIs, how long we wanted to operate on the moon, what the rough cost was going to be of Viper. And so we have been planning for that for a while. I think a news article came out comparing Viper's confirmation cost to probably something that NASA had probably described 1 or 2 or 3 years ago. And that's where they talked about the cost increase. So the fact that we made those resources under LDEP available for Viper, and it was talked about recently as part of its confirmation, getting out of PDR to baseline its cost, those didn't impact any other LDEP areas or areas outside of LDEP. It, for example, doesn't have anything to do with Discovery or New Frontiers or other areas in PSD.
Thank you, Joel. And lest we leave Kevin lonely there in the corner of my screen, we do have something for you, sir. What do you see as the near-term and long-term investments that can be made in the BLISS tech program? That's bioregenerative life support systems. And how might entrepreneurs and members of the community participate in that development?
Yeah, sure. So that's been an area that groups like Kennedy Space Center and Ames have been working in for years with respect to using microbiological systems and plant systems. And so right now, as well as down at Marshall. And so near term wise, I think there's got to be a study done in terms of how that work will be put together and the needs for that type of research. It certainly is an area that will be new to the space biology program, as well as the physical sciences program. But we're definitely going to need to look at it from the perspective of what's currently going on, where is commercial going, because certainly commercial areas are working those in bioregenerative systems. And so we don't necessarily want to reinvent the systems. What we want to do is really understand what is going on in those systems and how we can apply our fundamental and basic knowledge to that, and then work with Kennedy and our other centers that are doing the work from an applied perspective. So it's still early days. We really haven't had a lot of discussions on it, but it is one that has been brought up as being very important from an applications and translational perspective.
Great. Thanks, Kevin. There's a couple questions we have about Artemis Base Camp, and I'm going to try to roll them up into one. This is just for everybody, anyone who would like to comment on. There are questions about, just the general timeline for like when the first surface mission might start the base camp process, and what kind of steps are being taken to establish this across multidisciplines. It's a very broad question, but basically about the Artemis Base Camp and what the outlook is for that. And I think this is likely our last question, folks.
So Artemis Base Camp is, really important in terms of the sustained architecture, because it lets you put infrastructure on the surface that you can use for a long period of time. But it also is highly budget dependent, and it's more in the out years. And so we don't want to compromise getting back to the lunar surface, getting those early missions going. And so we'll prioritize the work we do along a trajectory as we start getting clarifications on the budget. So you heard our agency leaders talk about the fact that we're getting a lot of bipartisan support for Artemis, and that includes the base camp concept. But there are definitely going to be some details there once we get the budget out in public that will then let us reset some of those dates. But it's not just a turn it on and turn it off kind of a switch either. We will have a lot of trade space between deciding, do we land in the same place over missions before the base camp, or do we actually sample different locations? Do we choose some places primarily on figures of merit for science or access to multiple different types of regions? So we've got a lot of work going on. It will eventually be more open and part of our transparency and community input that you've heard Sandra and Joel talk about. And that trade space is something that we'll still have a lot of opportunities for scientific input into, which is, I think, quite exciting.
All right, thank you very much. And here we are right at the end of our allotted time for Q&A, so I'm going to wrap us up there. I want to thank all of our presenters and panelists for very informative presentations and for engaging with the questions. I also want to thank Kelsey Young for driving the slides for my hosting segment. And of course, I also want to recognize the sterling support we always enjoy from our friends at Survey Central out at Ames, especially Christina Gibbs and especially Ricky Guest, who makes all the technology work for us. We are a little bit late here, and we're going to cut into our break time just a little bit. We are scheduled to reconvene at 2:05 p.m. Eastern Time, 11:05 a.m. West Coast time. So we will adjourn for now, and we will see you back then. Thank you very much, everybody.